Thank you very much, Valentina. Thank you very much, Letizia. Thank you very much, Latifa, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and it's a great honor for me to talk to this community about some of the work we've been doing in context of gender in software engineering. Obviously, this is a very broad domain and our work is only a small part of it. So when we are talking about gender and community smells, the reason why we are looking at this kind of topics is, of course, because software development is a collaborative activity, which is not dissimilar to the harvest we see on this etching from Nicholas Peters on Bergham. So we see people of different genders, people of different ages, working together towards a shared goal, right? So for them, the shared goal is harvest. For us, the shared goal is creating software. In general, creating software has been always seen as work, as labor, and then subsequently as a collaborative activity. But because collaboration is not the only part of the story. In order to enable this collaboration, developers need to communicate with each other. So playing the devil's advocate, why should we actually care? So we need to care for communication because it's a way to coordinate the effort. It's a way to ensure that the goals that developers want to achieve can actually be achieved. But unfortunately, communication is not always a success. It can be broken. So for instance, one of the developers might decide to work in isolation and not communicate with their peers. Or we might have two subgroups of developers that do not communicate with each other except for one or two of their respective members. So this kind of undesirable communication patterns have been identified and described by Damian Tamburi and his co-authors, who called this community smells. So they have identified a bunch of those community smells, and in subsequent papers, Damian has successfully identified even more community smells. But in this talk, I'm going to focus on 4. So 2 of them I have already mentioned. So on the in the left upper corner, you see those 2 silos, right? So the community smells is organizational silo. This is a situation, as I explained, where we have 2 subgroups that they do not communicate with each other. Next to it, we have a lone wolf, who is an unsanctioned or defined contributor who is carrying out their work irrespectively of their peers, whatever decisions or whatever communications might be. And the lower part, we have radio silence and black cloud. So radio silence is an instance of the unique boundary spanner from social network analysis. Essentially, we have a person who is interposing themselves into every kind of formal interaction across the sub-communities. And this person can essentially cut off the communication between those communities or impose radio silence on them. Black cloud is a situation where there is so much communication going on that the participants can no longer separate useful communication from useless communication, signal from noise. It's related to information overload. So why would be interested in those smells? Recently, together with Fabio Palomba, Damian, Francesca Archele Fontana, Rocco, and Oliveto and Andy Zeidman, we have looked into relation between those community smells and source code patterns known as code smells. So we see that different community smells are associated with different code smells. Essentially, suboptimal organization of communication is related to suboptimal organization of the source code. So for instance, if I am a lone wolf, so if I don't care what other people think when they are looking at my work, what do they think about when they're looking at my code, I'm not going to spend an extra effort to organize my code such that somebody else can understand it. I mean, because I don't care. And this is essentially leading to the spaghetti code. But of course, the topic of this workshop is gender, and taking it slightly broader, diversity in general. So one might wonder why I'm actually talking about community smells and how diversity is related to this kind of community smells. So when it comes to diversity in teams in general, a priori, it is not clear whether it is good or bad, because there are different theories and they predict different outcomes. For example, it is known that people prefer to work with others who are similar to them in terms of values, beliefs, or attitudes, because it's very easy to communicate with sounding of what is important and what is not important. And we also have, there's also a theory which essentially explains that people categorize themselves into specific groups, and people from within the group are typically treated better than the outsiders. When I'm experiencing it as a teacher almost on a daily basis, when I'm giving students group projects, and if I'm not assigning them into groups, then I will end up with groups that contain either students who got their bachelor from our university. Sorry, I did mention STEM teaching in the master class. So either is a group which has got their bachelor at our university or elsewhere, but they are not mixing because there is essential self-categorization going on. We are from here, we are not from here. And if you are thinking about preferential treatment given to the in-group people, think about, for example, Harry Potter's and relation between Gryffindors and Slytherins. So from this perspective of those theories, diversity should be detrimental because it should be beneficial for you to work with people who are as similar to you as possible. On the other hand, it is known that diverse problem solvers outperform high ability problem solvers. And this is typically related to this notion of resources. Each one of us has their own resources, whether it is knowledge, skill, social connections, and so on and so forth. If we are very similar, then our resources are also very similar. So by collaborating, essentially, I'm not really gaining resources I did not have before. If, however, we are very different, so our resources are also very different. And by collaborating with you, I am getting access to your resources and you are getting access to my resources, and both of us benefit. And more or less along the same lines, there are studies which are relating diversity to creativity. So in our recent study, we have considered 3 kinds of diversity. And this study has been conducted by Stefano Lambiase, who is also here and who is, as far as I understand, the web chair of the event. So it's a great pleasure for me to talk about his work as well. So we have considered 3 diversity axes: gender diversity, geographical diversity, and the diversity in terms of national culture. So geographic diversity is defined as a standard deviation on the set of physical distance between community members. When it comes to the national culture, we have used the Hofstede 6D framework. I have to say that this framework is not beyond reproach. It has been criticized, but it is at the same time a popular and established framework, so we decided to use it. So according to this framework, national cultures differ along 6 dimensions. The first one is power distance index. So the power distance index is related to the extent the power distance in the society are being accepted or challenged by the society itself. In a very hierarchical society, people are readily accepted. There are people who have more power and less power, and that's the way the things are. In society with lower power distance index score, this kind of relation will be typically challenged. The second dimension is individualism versus collectivism. For a high level on the scale would mean that we have a very individualist society. Essentially, everyone is supposed to take care of themselves and eventually their immediate families, but by far not extended groups, extended families, and so on and so forth. So on the lower level of this dimension would mean that you are typically talking about tightly knit frameworks, tightly knit societies, where everybody is part of some community and is expected to be very loyal towards this community. The third dimension is masculinity or femininity. Masculinity is related to a preference for things like achievement, heroism, assertiveness, and femininity is typically associated with preference for cooperation, caring for weak, quality of life. So this kind of things which are stereotypically associated with women and men. Of course, since it's a national culture, it doesn't really imply that every individual from this culture would behave according to those expectations. The remaining three elements are related to avoiding uncertainty, long-term versus short-term orientation. For instance, in long term, people would be thinking about education as a way to prepare for future and so on. But for short term, it would be related to things which are, something which are giving you immediate gain, right? And then the last one is indulgence versus restraint, where people are expected to control themselves as opposed to gratify themselves as part of the basic and natural human needs. So just to give you a small example how those things work, I have put 3 countries on the slide: China, the Netherlands, and United States. And for the sake of simplicity, I am only showing the first 3 dimensions: power distance, individualism versus collectivism, and masculinity versus femininity. So what we see here is that the Chinese culture scores very high on this power distance, suggesting that in Chinese culture, it's much more acceptable that people have different power, and much more acceptable in any case than in 2 other countries. When it comes to the United States, we see a highly individualist country. Think about the Superman as an epitome of the American culture, right? Superman is operating alone. It's a highly individualist character. And then, of course, you see the Dutch culture, which scores much lower on masculinity, femininity than China and the United States, indicating that the Dutch culture is more feminine culture, and it favors collaboration as opposed to competition. So after this introduction to dimensions, let us try to go back to our community smells. So in a paper with in a series of papers with Gemma Catolina and Stefano Lambiase, we looked at relation between diversity variables and community smells. So I'm not going to dive into all of those errors, but I'll show only a couple of them. So first of all, we see that only power distance and individualism appear in the picture. This essentially means that, at least based on our data set, we could not observe relation between such diversity variables as uncertainty avoidance diversity or masculinity femininity diversity and the community smells. Second, we see that more gender diverse teams are less likely to develop communication problems related to inability to distinguish between useful and useless information. That's a black cloud community smell. And this is not surprising because we know from the literature that women tend to take mediatory roles in teams. the more gender diversity in the more gender diversity in teams, since it's a male-dominated field, it means that we have more women and subsequently more structured communication. When it comes to geographic diversity, we see that geographic diversity also reduces likelihood of this kind of black cloud, but we believe that it's not related to geographic diversity as such, but rather due to the fact that in order to manage a team which is geographically distributed, developers resort to tools such as Trello and Jira that already structure collaboration. And this is, in its turn, reduces likelihood of black cloud. However, these results have been obtained by means of statistical modeling. So we have mined data from GitHub, we have analyzed it using tools, and we would like to know whether people actually perceive importance of the variables we have considered and its relation to mitigation of community smells. So to understand this, we have conducted a couple of studies which involved interviewing or surveying people. So here we see 4 community smells we have seen before, and a Likert scale from 1 to 5, with 1 meaning not important at all, 5 meaning important. And in addition to gender, we also asked about diversity in experience, and we also asked about team size, because we wanted to compare gender diversity with some other variables. So we see here that gender is in general seen as being less relevant to mitigate presence of community smells than experience and team size. To understand why people actually believe that some of the variables are more or less important, we actually asked them to explain their ratings. And we have observed that respondents that tend to score gender lower, they tend to have lower experience with diverse teams, which corresponds to previous observation by Wang, that people tend to minimize importance of factors they're less knowledgeable about. We have also seen that people who believe gender to be more important tend to provide a more refined, more clear, or more detailed argumentation why they believe it to be important, as opposed to individuals that think that gender is not important. When it comes to when it comes to community smells, so mitigation of community smells, we also wanted to know how those problems can actually be solved. Ultimately, we don't just want to observe community smells, we want to know how to address them. And our study has identified 5 different strategies which can be used to mitigate community smells. Those are from left to right. Restructuring the community, meaning changing composition of the team ultimately, mentoring, creation of communication plans, monitoring, and cohesion exercising. And different community smells call for different mitigation strategies. So here we see the dark cells corresponding to at least 10 responses, and light gray cells correspond to 5 to none responses. So for example, if we have a situation of an organizational silo, then most of our respondents would indicate, the largest group of our respondents would indicate that the team has to be reformed. While if you are talking about black cloud, where we have confusion between useful and useless communication, then a communication plan might be a way to go. Of course, this kind of observations might be perceived differently by different cultures. And this is why we have replicated this study with Brazilian developers. So we have surveyed 184 Brazilian developers coming from different regions of Brazil. And we have looked only at strategies which got at least 10 votes. So you see that in most of the cases, the general results agree with the previous study. So you see dark gray cells also bearing numbers, which is essentially the way we discuss agreement. But we also see that, for instance, for radio silence, Brazilian software developers prefer to restructure a team, while in our previous studies, the respondents have preferred mentoring. So this might be related to differences in culture. This might be related to just be an artifact of the study. So you need to consider to take a closer look at this kind of results. So far, I have focused on the results of our studies. So in the remaining part of the talk, I would like to briefly discuss how we conduct those studies. I would like to open this black box. So typically, we analyze data, very often from GitHub, and combine it with talking to people through surveys or interviews. So just for you as an example, when we've been talking about this community smell, code smell, we have first analyzed code and communication of 9 large open source projects. And then we have interviewed 10 project managers from the industry to validate our results. So let us start with the easiest part. So when it comes to community smells, there are at least 3 tools now which can be used to identify community smells. They are based on different kinds of artifacts. For instance, Codeface for smells works with mailing lists. Kayaulu is a much more recent tool, so it is capable of taking into account also GitHub communication. But the tools are around. If you want to talk about community smells from the perspective of talking to people, then we can use vignettes. The point here is that we cannot really ask developers, have you ever encountered lone wolf? Because you don't necessarily know what lone wolf is and what does it actually mean. So we use vignettes. Here we see a small example of a vignette corresponding to organizational silo. I will give you a couple of seconds to read the slide. Okay, so here you have a small story, and by reading the story, we hope that the respondents can recognize themselves and indicate whether they have encountered this kind of situations in the past, and if yes, what kind of mitigation strategy they have applied to resolve this issue. Of course, topics related to persons like gender or national culture, they are much more difficult to detect based on archival data, and they're also much more difficult to detect based on talking to people. In any case, whatever techniques we are going to discuss in the next slides, we need to remember that gender is a complex social construct, and any kind of technique we are using, in particular any kind of automated technique we might be using, will necessarily make simplifying assumptions. And those simplifying assumptions has to be remembered and reiterated and reconsidered in each and every context. So on top of this, gender is privacy sensitive. There might be many reasons why individual contributors and entire companies or projects would not like us to know gender of their gender. For instance, many women developers prefer not to disclose their gender in open source context due to safety concerns. There are projects that do not want us to know the genders of their members for instance, because they might be less gender diverse than they would like themselves. So when it comes to talking to people, so asking about gender in surveys or interviews, a common guide for this kind of work is by Norman Bradburn from 2004. And while in general, it's not a bad guide, it is hopelessly outdated when it comes to asking about gender. So you see here that it is conflating sex and gender. It only offers 2 boxes and so on and so forth. Just to stress the importance of going beyond gender binary, I would like to say that a recent survey of Stack Overflow has shown that more than 1% of contributors do not identify either as women or men. And while this is a minority, it is a sizable minority. Compared to the population in general, this is 3 times more. Essentially, this suggests that there are more non-binary individuals among software developers at Stack Overflow than in population in general. We could discuss after this talk, why do we think that this is happening? So this essentially means that when asking about gender, we need to be very careful, and we need to at least offer another option. So one possible solution was proposed by Greta Bauer, when in addition to male and female, there was a third option called something else specified. Unfortunately, this is a problematic question, mostly because it has clearly indicated preference for 1 and 2, as opposed to something else, right? Whatever. This is known as othering. This is not a way for people to feel welcome and encouraged to answer our survey. On top of it, again, we have male and female as opposed to women and men. In practice, it turned out that this question doesn't work. Here we see answers provided by trans feminine and trans masculine individuals to this question. So you see that they essentially are giving answers all over the place, simply because they've been trying to figure out what was the intention of the survey designer, and they've been reaching different conclusions. Moreover, when this item has been used as an interview, the respondents have indicated that answering this question was taxing for them. So essentially, it was hard for them to answer this question. So a much better solution would be to ask an open question: where do you identify on the gender spectrum? This is a recommendation of our communities, colleagues from the human-computer interaction field. Unfortunately, whatever techniques we are using, we will be inherently limited by the number of people who will respond to our surveys. In software engineering surveys, I have seen percentages going up to 20% if you are lucky, but often those percentages fall below 10. So if you are looking at a typical mining study, which involves something like 60,000 people, 100,000 people, right? If you want to get 100,000 responses, then we might need to send 1 million invitations given the response rate. Essentially, if I'm going to send 1 million invitations, I mean, I can do it technically. GitHub is big enough and my mail server will support it. But if I'm going to do it and you're going to do it and somebody else is going to do it, then our poor developers will be even more over-surveyed than they already now, and they simply will reject our invitations. So this is where the automated gender detection tools are coming into picture. All of those tools are based on the assumption that self-presentation and artifacts created can be used to identify gender. This is an assumption. If you don't believe in it, don't use the tools. I am perfectly aware of the limitations of this assumption, but as I said, this is the only way if you want to analyze data at scale. Roughly speaking, those tools fall into three large categories: name to gender, face to gender, and artifact to gender. So name to gender is probably the easiest one to understand because in many countries, certain names are associated with certain genders. So here you see maps of most frequently used names in Europe for women and for men. This is, of course, more tricky than it might appear because the very same name, such as Andrea, might be typically associated with women in Germany and with men in Italy. So this is why name to gender tools typically try to use geographic information as a key to interpretation of the genderization of the name. A more advanced tool such as NumSOR goes beyond geographic information and tries to derive cultural background based on the surname, because of course many of us no longer live in countries where we've been born. You have second generation immigrants and so on and so forth. But ultimately, all those tools work on the premise that you have names, and some names are more commonly associated with one gender than another. The second group of tools is related to face to gender. So this is one of those tools. It's Face++. There are more of those tools. They are looking at the facial structure, looking at cheekbone structure, eventually looking at beards and so on, looking at hair, and trying to identify gender based from it. So good news here, at least for this particular photo of me, Face++ has correctly identified my gender. It also tried to identify my age. This was slightly less successful. But also here, for instance, if you are trying to apply this technique for transgender developers, the tool can give you any other answer, essentially depending on the irrelevant variables such as lighting or whatever. Finally, the last group of techniques is based on the assumption that people of different genders produce different text. This mostly has been done in context of creative writing or such as novels. It has been done in context of source code as part of source code steganography, essentially establishing who is the author of this fragment of source code. This works reasonably well for limited groups of people. So when we essentially have a number of candidates and we need to choose which one of them is the author. It works much worse if the list of candidates is potentially infinite. But from the gender perspective, if we know who if you have a limited number of people, then we might also just ask this limited number of people about their gender. So we don't really need an automatic tool. In any case, whatever tool you might use, there are considerations to be taken into account. And the first one, and probably the most obvious one, is accuracy. So, for instance, for name-based resolution, Sophie Chu and her co-authors have observed between 60 and 84% of correctly genderized names. And as usual, for Western names, those percentages are going into the 90s, even into high 90s. For Eastern names, such as Chinese names, percentages drop quite significantly. The second point is the matter of reliability. So as I already mentioned, quite a number of women on open source do not disclose their gender. And this quote suggests essentially that the consequence of this decision is, of course, that no tool can reasonably identify the gender of the contributor. And finally, all those tools are working with gender binary as primary assumption. Tools based on names, which have been surveyed by Santa Maria and Mihaljevic, they're doing it in a slightly different ways. They typically do not just say a woman, a man. They will give some range between -1 and 1, for example. But this range does not suggest that the tool is somehow aware of existence of other genders. It simply indicates confidence. So, for instance, if 1 is a woman and -1 is a man, 0 would mean that the tool has no clue what gender of this person might be, and 0.5 might mean that the tool thinks that it is more likely to be a woman than a man. So when it comes to another variable we have considered in our study, namely diversity in terms of national culture, also here there are quite some ways of inferring this information, and also here, in the same way as it is the case with gender, the notion of national culture is highly complicated, and we are necessarily limited to approximations. So all the work in this field uses location as a proxy for national culture. Again, I'm showing my profile, not necessarily because I'm so egoistic, but simply because it was very easy for me to get consent of myself to do this kind of things, and I don't have consent of anyone else. So here we have an indication of my location on GitHub, and it is fine. However, I'm not really Dutch, and so there are many people like me. Moreover, on Stack Overflow, roughly 25% of users provide location. So this means that 75% of users do not provide location. And if you are looking at this location as provided, it is not always reliable, because this can be something like third drop from the sun or dev null, right? So there can be many ways of indicating location which cannot be mapped to any specific geographic location. To make this even worse, the Netherlands is a country where I work. It's not the country where I live. It's not the country where I've been born, and it's not the country whose nationality I have. So we need to be careful with how we are interpreting this kind of information. Now, SOAR, which I already mentioned before in context of gender detection, has recently decided to take a step in also in the direction of location, well, in terms of nationality/culture, and they have 3 different variables: country of residence, country of origin, and diaspora. Some of those answers are correct. Some of those answers are incorrect. So for instance, for me, country of residence, I live in Belgium and not in Russia. My country of origin is actually Russia and not Ukraine. And I'm actually Jewish, but I'm not in the I'm not in the US. So to what extent this kind of tool is applicable, it's a good question. So ultimately, the answers here are kind of okay-ish. They are reasonable to some extent, but of course, whenever you are using this kind of tools, you need to be very careful with the impact of imprecision on conclusions you are going to derive. So to summarize this part of the talk, we have discussed 2 large groups of techniques that can be used to identify national culture and gender. So we ultimately can either use an automatic tool, an algorithmic tool, or talk to people by conducting surveys and interviews. None of those is perfect, and this is an extremely important thing to recognize. Any algorithmic tool you might consider using is making simplifying assumptions. This kind of simplifying assumptions might not be so problematic if you have many, many data points, but it can be extremely problematic when it comes to individuals. On the other hand, questionnaires simply do not scale. One of the largest survey-based studies in software engineering I'm aware of is a pandemic programming study of Paul Ralph and his co-authors, has involved slightly more than 2,000 responses, but it was a multilingual survey involving, if I remember correctly, 7 different languages. And of course, the topic was extremely hot when the survey has been conducted. People have been affected by the pandemic, and people were very, very willing to respond to this kind of surveys. This is not the case for your average software engineering survey we are conducting. Choice of the technique should depend on the research question, as choice of any research method, but it is extremely important not only to discuss the reasons or the advantages of the tools which made us choose them, but also the limitations and the implications of those limitations on the problem we are going to study. So for example, when we've been talking about relation between national culture and community smells, we, by lack of better, we had to resort to geographic location as proxy for national culture, which would, for instance, for United States mean that all the Americans have exactly the same national culture, which is simply not reasonable. So we are making this kind of simplifying assumptions to take a step forward, but of course, it's just a small step, and we need to be continuously reflecting on what are we doing and how are we doing it. So to summarize, by combining repository mining, by combining large-scale data analysis and surveys or interviews, we can observe relations between diversity in teams, specifically gender diversity, geographic diversity, and national culture diversity on the one hand, and community smells on the other hand. And we can also link those community smells to code smells, to suboptimal organization of the source code. And we have also proposed several ways of mitigating community smells. However, those studies are typically using machinery, which is on the one hand allows us to obtain fine-grained insights by the sheer value of large amount of data we are typically analyzing, but at the same time, they are making simplifying assumptions, which might be highly problematic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for your interesting and inspiring talk. As usual, good points.
Yes.
Focus.
Thank you very much, Paul. So Paul Ralph is saying in the chat, the pandemic programming questionnaire was delivered in 12 languages, but there have been larger surveys, including by Tony Gorshek, Evan Tempera, and Lefteris Angelis on the use of software design models. Cool. Thank you very much, Paul.
Exactly. Thanks, Paul, for highlighting this one. So I want to ask to the audience.
Valentina, I don't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
I still don't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you, Valentina. We hear you.
You hear me? Okay.
Yes,
so
yes,
Alexander?
Maybe something is happening on my side. Let me just try to stop the screen.
I have a question.
Exactly.
If anybody else have questions, I think they should.
Okay, I will disconnect and I will reconnect again. Sorry.
Okay, don't be worried, Alexander. Technical issues can happen with the online conference.
I would like, since we are here waiting for Alexander, I would like to remember you that we have this Google Doc that is a shared file. I see that somebody has started to write some notes there, to add screenshots. So I'm not sure what we can do with such a document, but if you are like me, who like to take notes, we can try to make these common notes and later we can decide what to do with the notes.
Okay, so as soon as Alexander will be back, we have one.
Yes, I am back.
Yeah. So before, of course, the question of Letizia, I want to give the stage to Katia Tuma. She wants to ask something to you, Alexander.
Thank you, Valentina. And thanks, Alexander, for the talk. It was really nice. I had a more practical question, because what do you do, for example, if your target population is typically not, let's say, active or recognizable on open source like GitHub? How can you actually scale your studies, even if, let's say, that I would be willing to sacrifice and take those assumptions and sacrifice some precision, but it's simply that I don't really see how to recognize this target population on open source?
How do you, like, what is your target population? I mean, are you
Yeah,
talking about open source, or are you talking about companies?
So it could also be open source. It's just that it's a niche area, because I'm investigating so security, either security developers or security engineers. So I'm not really sure if on GitHub there are, let's say, that it's possible to automatically identify these people. So that's my question.
So if it's an open source project, then you probably have a mailing list if it's not on GitHub. So mailing list means that you have their names, and then essentially all the tools which you've been talking about are equally applicable. Moreover, you are usually better off on a mailing list than on GitHub, because on the mailing list, people are forced, or more or less likely to use their real names, as opposed to, for instance, something like Stack Overflow. But again, this would depend on the company project and the company culture and project culture, sorry. We have already seen in the past people like Mr. Happy Pants and Coffee Tish as usernames on mailing lists. So this could be one option. If you are talking about companies which you want to enter, then typically you can, I mean, if you have a backing from the company, then you can run a survey.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you,
Valentina. I think Miguel. I think we should give the time to Miguel.
Miguel, exactly.
So thanks for a great talk as usual. I'm wondering what strategy we could use if we want to do some cross-sectional study. So people who have several characteristics. For instance, suppose you want to study Black women in open source software. How would you identify them?
Sorry, how would I identify whom?
Black women in open source software. So
okay, so how would I identify
an example like this?
So this is immediately becoming one of those hard to reach populations, right? So there are typically two things. Some of these populations have their own channels. So there might be a channel for, I don't believe that there is a channel for Black women in open source, but there might be a channel specifically for Black women in a specific project or in a specific community. Alternatively, there are typically platforms for minority groups in software development. Again, I don't know whether there is a Slack for Black women, but for instance, there is definitely Slack for LGBTIQ in software development. Finally, and this is what you can do when analyzing artifacts fails, and this is what people are doing, for instance, when they are studying drug addicts, right? You can use referral-based sampling. And here I can only refer to the wonderful paper by Paul Rolfe and Sebastian Baltes on sampling strategies. Essentially, the referral-based sampling involves talking to people and asking them to recruit the next group of people you can talk to. But it is, you need to be more careful than what I can summarize in one sentence. I really recommend you checking this paper.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. We have a question from Letizia. So Letizia, if you want to formulate, since we have other 10 minutes to formulate a question to Alexander. So we are perfectly on time. Letizia.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Alexander. It's really, you are a pioneer in this field, and I admire very much your research. And in my head, when I work with or for gender equality, I see three big goals. One is the economic goal. When I go to the companies and try to get sponsors, I say, look, if you will sponsor our gender activities, you will become more successful because we will produce more candidates, da, da, da. So I use the economy argument, but I really burn for the social justice argument that we would like to give women and men and everybody the same opportunities. And also there is this hypothesis that I really would like to explore in the future, that if we have diverse team, it will not be only be beneficial for the economy, but also for the environment. So my question is, your work about community smell, would you frame it under the economic argument? And most important for me, do you think that it makes sense to operate with these three big goals when looking at gender studies?
Well, thank you very much for this question. So I think that when talking to companies, at least my experience of talking to companies is that they are pretty open for one kind of arguments and one kind of arguments only, and this is economic ones. At least the companies I'm talking to, they don't really care so much about environment. I mean, yes, of course, they want to put some stickers, but you know, it's not really something which they are kind of profoundly care as companies. Even so, individuals there might have, of course, different opinions. And by the same token, they don't really necessarily think about social justice because they don't necessarily see it as something which is immediately providing a value. So independent, of course, again, individual people working for those companies might care profoundly for this kind of things, but getting companies on board is not that easy. So yes, you can frame community smells, in particular due to relation with code smells, as something that companies should care about. Also here, there are many differences in terms of culture and in terms of different countries. My feeling is that, for instance, in the United States, this entire diversity discussion is miles ahead of what we have in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, there is a substantial group of people who are experiencing the diversity discussions in general as an imported discussion, right? It's not really something we should be caring about. It is an imported discussion. It happens somewhere far, far away, and we are just getting signals from afar that we should be caring, but we really don't. So this is a problematic thing, and economic arguments help to bridge this a little bit, right? Because at least in the Dutch culture, people tend to care about money, and companies tend to care about money. So when it comes to those three, sorry, I'm taking so much time to answer a question. So when it comes to those three axes, I think that number 2 and number 3 can be kind of put together under the number of sustainable development, because there are also different things there. And then you can kind of oppose short-term vision of those economic goals and long-term vision of this more sustainable goals. And hopefully, you know, gender diversity is beneficial, diversity in general is beneficial for both, but depending on which context you are operating, you might stress either this one or that one. And Paul, thank you very, very much for the references. You can hire me as your marketing manager. You can hire me as a co-author. You can hire me in many ways.
I would like also to add that we have hired you and nothing else add. So it's important to have you on board, Alexander, in all this kind of work, because your expertise and your professionality, first of all, made also improvement and a good point in each research. I agree with the Paul that we need you for sure. So there are other questions from the audience? So I have a last question, since we have some minutes. So you mentioned the problem also of the cultural diversity. And you mentioned also the problem that now with the last 2 years of pandemic, everything was difficult to socialize, was difficult to work, we were remotely. So if you have to suggest to person that want really to balance the gender, or really to consider this aspect in the company or the research group, nowadays with the new environment mode that is more remotely than physical, which is your first advice based on your experience?
So essentially you are saying I would like to establish a more gender balanced environment, more gender balanced team in a remote environment.
Yes, now that we have this kind of new extra problem on top, that is the fact that the vast majority of the people stay at home work, and we cannot have anymore the same possibility to create a good environment, like for example we are creating here in our university in Finland, where we are in offices together with all the facility and everything. So at home is difficult, but also in the other reality.
I think that there are many things you can do. It's kind of difficult to say, to mention only one. And if you are looking at challenges induced by the pandemic, there is this very nice paper by Machado on the Brazilian material, where they have discussed the gender angle in terms of challenges experienced by the developers during the pandemic. And the problems that were experienced by a man were much easier to solve than those which were experienced by women. Because for men essentially would be very happy with an ergonomic chair and noise cancelling headset, while for women you actually had to organize childcare because the primary challenges of Brazilian software developers for women were related to schools being closed. And as you can imagine, companies can do the first one, but can hardly do the second one. So when it comes today, then with schools essentially being open and this kind of stuff being open, we might be thinking about re-evaluating the observations of Machado, to what extent the challenges that developers experience today are still gender colored through this remote work lens. Again, it was Brazil, so in different cultures it might be completely different. So when you decided to work online, right, then of course you need to be sure that everybody is included. So inclusion is extremely important, and this particularly means that people should be able to bring themselves to the office. So yesterday at Chase, I have seen a very nice work of Paul, you really need to pay me. Ronnie de Souza Santos and Paul Ralph about the remote work during the COVID times. And in their work, it was not gendered, but things we've been discussing there seem to be very useful anyhow. So things like, you have this costume day, when essentially you are either dressed in the national costume, or are you showing some kind of pin or whatever element that shows you as a person, right? So this is essentially a way of bringing yourself to the office, which is barely possible with remote work. So this kind of mechanism foster inclusion through collaboration, right? You are disclosing more of who you are, but at the same time, because it's remote work, if you are not feeling comfortable, you can just close your laptop and disconnect. So this was essentially one of the strongest things we have observed for remote work, even before the pandemic, and the work with Janae Ford and Rit Milovich.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for your important point that you raised up in your answering. So if there is no question from the audience again, there is one question, so the last. So by Madura Chatteria, sorry if I don't pronounce correct your name. My apologies.
Yeah, it's Madhura Chatterjee. You pronounced it correct. So, sir, you mentioned something about artifact to gender, how you can differentiate based on text, the gender of the author. So my question is, how is that possible? So I'm assuming that it's the way you differentiate is woman. If the author is woman, then it's more emotional, the text, and if the author is man, it's more diverse, the text. So is that the case?
Well, roughly yes, right? So when it comes to genderizing text, it's, as I said, it is mostly done for creative writing, and then indeed for personal writing, such as blogs. It's related to choice of adjectives. It's related to choice of pronouns. If I remember correctly, women authors tend to use second-person pronouns more often than men authors. When it comes to first-person pronouns, different sources disagree. So application of this kind of ideas to the source code is not obvious because it's, of course, more constrained form of writing. And this is why I've been talking about steganography, right? So there are attempts to identify authorship, and if you know who is the author of this piece of code, then you also might know their gender. So this typically works if you have a limited list of suspects. So for instance, if you are a teacher and you have 25 students, you want to know who has authored this piece of text, and you know that this is one of those 25. This becomes much more problematic if your list is potentially infinite and you want to establish authorship of a random piece of text of someone online, right? So from the gender perspective, if you have a small number of people, then you can just survey and you essentially know for each one of those 25, how do they identify in terms of gender. If you are working in an open setup, then it's, of course, all bets are off.
Okay, so can I ask another question?
Very, very fast. So because we have just a couple of minutes.
Yeah, sure. So I just want to know if there's some kind of software for the seeing text and deciding if the person writing is male, female, binary, non-binary.
Yes, you can look into the paper of Ben Hermans and Kruger in one of the previous editions of this workshop, actually. I think it was 2019. Please correct me.
Was 2019 in ICSI in Montreal, correct, Alexander?
Right, it's GE 2019. They have provided an overview of research in this field.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much for, first of all, to our great speaker, Alexander Serebrenik, and to all the audience that formulate questions and attend this keynote.